Morning, how y'all doing? There's only one person in this room I see. Good morning again. Glad that y'all are here. This morning we continue our journey through Luke. We're at the last couple stages, so it's exciting to see just everything come together and what Luke is doing. So to start off, just wanted to share a quick story. Malachi, by now, he's about to be 7 months, and he's at the stage now where he is starting to recognize like faces and a little bit of stranger danger. But as some of y'all may have met him, you know he's definitely way more chill than Maddie. But he's starting to develop this sort of mannerism where if you grab him like from the back and you sit down, he'll like arch his back and like lean and kind of like trying to figure out who's holding me. And if he recognizes your face, if he trusts that you are safe, then he'll just resume his normal activities. But if he realizes that, something's off, there's something not right about the hands that hold me, or this face that I'm looking at is just not quite right. Or if he's like Maddie and he sees Stephen's face and starts to cry, Malachi will do just the same. And so, as we're thinking about like babies and their development and the way that they make associations, for the entirety of our lives, even as youth or as adults, we make such associations and relationships. For some, when they smell or see the sight of stinky tofu and blue cheese, they think immediately, that's disgusting. And for others, when they hear the words, skydiving, Six Flags, bungee jumping, there's an immediate drop in the gut that happens, immediate dread that is associated. If you haven't caught on, I'm actually just describing myself here. So we, or just myself, avoid these sort of things that stir up negative feelings as much as possible. But we also have associations and relationships with people and things that bring about positive feelings of happiness and safety and comfort and fun. But no matter what, we ordain our lives, we govern our lives in a way that we're around these sort of happy feelings, things that give us comfort and safety, things like hopefully your family, your friends, your home. And so if you're following my train of thought, we have all sorts of feelings and associations that are tied with our homes and with our schools and with our families, our workplaces, our devices, and every sort of thing that we can think of in life. But what I want to press into this morning, and this may be the most important association we will ever make in our lives, is this. I wonder what sort of feelings and thoughts come to your mind when you read about, think about, talk about, or hear about the person of Jesus. Because who he is in our minds, who we accept him to be, who we believe Jesus to be, will elicit a response from us. If he is truly king, then we will walk in his ways in allegiance to his commands and to his heart. Our entire lives will revolve around who he is. But if he is just some cool dude in history that's just done some great things, loved people well, some cool miracles, and that's about it, and I'm just here on Sundays, or maybe I'm just forced to be here on Sundays, then the rest of my week will show that I have absolutely no inclination or no propensity to know more about who Jesus is and to walk in his footsteps. So the question that I have for us this morning is, who is Jesus to you? As we've made our journey through Luke and nearing, again, the last legs of his gospel account, this is the question that he has been presenting before us, and the question that I want to, for all of us to wrestle with this morning. Who has Jesus revealed himself to be, and how will you respond? So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Luke chapter 22, verses 39 through 71. It's a large text that we're going to get through, so you got to lean in some. But as we walk through this text, we're going to see three qualities of Jesus that I hope will command a faithful response from us. Jesus will first face great anguish. Jesus will second be a victim of a great injustice. And Jesus, third, will suffer deep rejection. As we walk through each of these three incidents, I pray that our eyes would be open to how he responds in each of these pressure situations and how he reveals himself to be, and then we in turn respond in faithfulness and greater allegiance towards him. So, chapter 22 of Luke, verse 39. And he came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, saying, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation." While he was still speaking, there came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He drew near to Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus said to him, "Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" And when those who were around him saw what would follow, they said, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, "No more of this," and he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness." Then they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house, and Peter was following at a distance. And when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down among them. And the servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the light and looking closely at him, and said, "This man also was with him." But he denied, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." And a little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." And after an interval of about an hour, still another insisted, saying, "Certainly, this man also was with him, for he too is a Galilean." Peter said, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And he went and wept bitterly. The men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking him, "Prophesy, who is it that struck you?" And they said many other things against him, blaspheming him. When they came, the assembly of the elders of the people gathered together, both chief priests and scribes. They led him away to their council, and they said, "If you are the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, you will not believe, and if I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God." And so they all said, "Are you the Son of God then?" And he said to them, "You say that I am." Then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips." As we head into the first part of our text this morning, it's verses 39 to 46. We're going to see Jesus be filled with great agony. Luke tells us that after they partook of the Last Supper together, Jesus and his disciples made their way to the Mount of Olives. And upon arrival, Jesus gives them the command to pray that they may not fall into temptation. And then Jesus, he himself withdraws from them about a stone's throw away, and he prays, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." And the angel of heaven appears to Jesus and strengthens him. But Jesus, feeling still deep with anguish, continues to labor in prayer. And when he's done praying, Jesus returns back to his disciples only to find that they are sleeping, exhausted from the mental distress and fatigue and emotional grief. So Jesus urges them again, pray that you may not fall into temptation. So in this first section here, there's a couple of observations I want to point to your attention. The first question that I have is, what's the temptation that Jesus commands his disciples to pray that they would not fall into? In other words, what does Jesus want the disciples to prepare themselves for through prayer? Look back with me in the earlier part of 22. The Last Supper Jesus has with his disciples, he says, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have y'all, that he might sift y'all like wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith, Simon, may not fail. And when you, Simon, have turned again, strengthen your brothers." See, beyond the irony and the tension that we can see on the surface, there's great spiritual warfare that is going on. Satan is demanding to violently shake up the disciples to their core so he can test their allegiance to him. He wants to thwart God's plan and take as many as he can from Jesus. Can you imagine? Put yourself in Jesus' shoes, the urgency and the sincerity with which Jesus implores and commands his disciples, pray. Pray, keep praying so you don't fall. There's something that we ought to learn as followers of Jesus Christ today about the value and the power of prayer when this section here is bookended by Jesus' command to pray. It's the same in the beginning and at the end. Second, I want you to look at how Jesus models this prayer when he's filled with great anguish. The way that Jesus prepares, the way that he copes with the thought of and the agony of his upcoming suffering and death is by going to the Father in prayer. And it's not just a quick, short prayer, "God, help me, amen." No, Jesus labors in prayer. He is dependent on prayer to unite with him with God. What does Luke tell us after praying? Jesus, being strengthened by an angel of the Lord, continues to pray with greater earnest and fervor. Jesus is agonizing. He's wrestling. He's toiling in prayer. He's locked in his prayer to God so hard that his sweat becomes as thick as great drops of blood. But look at the disciples. Luke records them as being crashed out. In their feeling sorrow, in their distress and fatigue, they just fall asleep. Instead of preparing themselves for battle by praying, instead of listening to their master's commands to pray, they cope with their anguish by falling asleep. I wonder if Judas and Peter would still have fallen short if they just took the time to commit themselves to be intentional in prayer. What coping mechanisms do you personally resort to when you're under duress? Do you immediately turn to the Lord in prayer when you're feeling burdened and down and in sorrow and in fear of what's about to come? Or instead, do you go and grab a couple of beers and veg out? Do you binge watch a Netflix show? Do you give into your lustful cravings? Do you doom scroll on social media? Do you hide behind your covers in bed? Who or what do you lean into when you're down? Next, I want you to notice the content of Jesus' prayer. Look how he starts off. Iris, can you help me hit the next slide? The clicker died. He starts off with Father. He has such an intimate relationship with God that even in his suffering, he reaches out and knows God as Father. He leans into him. He depends on him. And how many of us actually view God as our Father? Or is our relationship with God just one that is of mere convenience? That we've dumbed down God to the status of our own personal genie in a bottle to help us out of predicaments whenever we need. And when we're fine, he stays in that bottle. Next slide. Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. In his humanity, Jesus deeply desires to be free from this intense suffering he's about to endure. Father, if there is any other way, could you please remove this cup of wrath against sin from me? Please. What does God do? God hears the outcries of his son and sends an angel to strengthen him. God answers his prayer not by giving into the request that Jesus asked for and taking away that source of suffering, but by giving him an extra measure of grace to persevere through the trial at hand. Jesus is strengthened through prayer. And sometimes when we ask God when we ask Him to remove our suffering, to remove our trials, to remove our heartache, to remove our persecution, instead of removing it, God may give us an extra measure of grace and strength to help us persevere through it so that we can be mature and complete, not lacking anything, as James says. But on a deeply theological level, God's response of sending an angel to strengthen Jesus rather than giving in to Jesus' needs so that there's no other way. There's no other way for sin and death and evil to be defeated. As Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21, it's on one of the slides, Iris, thanks. For our sake, He, God, made Him, Jesus, to be sin who knew no sin, so that in Him we might become the righteousness of God. Jesus didn't have to die, but He humbly chose to and willingly chose to. If there was any other way, then there would be no point for Jesus to die on the cross and to be our substitute in carrying the weight of humanity's rebellion. And last comment about Jesus' prayer, I want you to look at the bookends. If you are willing, that's how He starts. And how He ends is, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Next slide. The first quality that I want you to see about Jesus, our King, this morning is His obedience. He is totally allegiant to carrying out the Father's will so that God then can carry out His plan and purpose to restore His glory by reconciling all of creation unto Himself. But this all hinges upon the obedience of Jesus. If at any point Jesus decides to call it quits, all of this breaks down. Jesus is no longer free of sin. The unity of the triune God breaks down, and there's no hope for humanity. Faithfulness requires diligence. Faithfulness requires diligence. We simply cannot be faithful. We simply cannot obey unless we are willing to make that commitment to pray and to be in complete dependence on God. If Jesus pleaded with the disciples to prepare for the future suffering by praying for faithfulness, then why aren't we doing the same? The past week or so, Maddie has started to develop the phrasing, I want, whatever. I want apples. I want to play. And it's been great to see her learn this new skill and this new phrase. It's cute at times and also very frustrating in other times. It's great when we tell her it's time for her bath and she agrees and says, yes, I want to take bath. But it's frustrating when she says, I want to go outside and it's upper 90 degrees. And she won't stop insisting until we actually take a walk. And then after a minute she says, too hot, Dada, too hot, go home. She knows what she wants and what she likes. But she doesn't have the perspective that everything that she wants is good for her. She loves pancakes and fruits, but those are better enjoyed after eating her proteins and other nutrients. See, as parents, we have the perspective of what may actually be good for her at her young age. The more that she is in sync with our understanding, the better the outlook. When we follow in the footsteps of the first man and the first woman who sought to taste what looked good in their own eyes in the Garden of Eden, when we walk in disobedience, we miss out on all the glory, all the good that God has prepared for us in His perfect timing. But when we are aligned with God, completely dependent on Him, obedient to His will, we get to enjoy all the blessings that result from God's intended plans and purposes. As we continue on the second section of our narrative this morning, which is verses 47 to 53, we're going to see Jesus go through a grave injustice. Here, Jesus implores His disciples to be on guard in prayer, and then a crowd made up of chief priests, officers of the temple, and elders approach Jesus. Judas, one of the 12 disciples who closely followed Jesus, leads this crowd, and he gives Jesus a kiss. Now, the rest of the disciples who were on Jesus' side began to understand pretty quickly the gravity of what was about to happen. And one of them, we know from John's Gospel, Peter, strikes with his sword and cuts off one of the man's ears. And Jesus immediately stops his disciples from wreaking more violence and havoc, and he heals the man's ear who had been cut off. And the section closes with Jesus asking the crowd, "Why are you confronting me as if I am a violent robber? You never laid hands on me before when I was with you every day in the temple. But now, at this time, I will give you and the power of darkness this time to reign." A few observations here that I want to bring to your attention in this section. How ironic it is that Judas would betray Jesus with a kiss. A kiss being a symbol of affection now is a symbol of defection. How ironic that an unnamed woman who Luke records in chapter 7 was a sinner, an uninvited guest to this party, and she comes in and kisses the feet of Jesus, anoints his feet with an alabaster jar. But Judas here, who was one of the 12, his name is known. He walks with Jesus closely for 3 years, and he betrays Jesus with a kiss. That's what sin does. That's what sin does. Sin is deceptive. Sin is manipulative. It twists things that were meant for good, intentions that were meant to edify and to unite, and turns them into betrayal, into ugliness, violence, chaos, and death. The next thing I want you to notice how Jesus addresses this crowd who was against him. Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness. The chief priests, the officers of the temple, and the elders who make up this crowd have seen Jesus teach and preach and perform miracles and heal people and forgive sins day after day after day in the temple. And they never approached Jesus once like this in front of all the common people in the light of day. But in the shroud of darkness, in the cover of night, they approach an innocent man with swords and clubs as if he was a dangerous criminal. In fact, it was Jesus who, in Luke chapter 19, was recorded as driving out those who returned the temple into a marketplace, calling them out for making it a den of robbers. But now he is the one being approached as a robber. And Peter, what is Peter doing? In his zeal and loyalty to Jesus, Peter defends Jesus with the sword. But then he also completely misses the heart of his master, of his king, and what he came into the world to accomplish. Yet, even in the midst of all of these injustices, the betrayal of Jesus, the violence of Peter, and the armed approach of the crowd, Jesus' response is that he has compassion for his enemies, and he heals the man whose ear had been cut off. The second quality, next slide, I want you to see about Jesus here is his compassion. Even in such a tense and high-pressure moment, Jesus has compassion, and he heals. He doesn't call down legions of angels to come to his aid and deliver him, though they would have if he asked. Instead, with the last miracle he ever performs on earth, he loves on and heals his enemy. This is what he has been doing. This is what Jesus does. This is what his kingdom is about. This is how he has been restoring glory back to the Father. In the person and in the work of Jesus, he fulfills the prophecy of Isaiah 35, that the blind see, the deaf hear, the lame walk, and the mute sing. How many of us, those of us who identify with Christ, would do the same? When we are on the receiving end of misunderstanding and ingratitude from loved ones, when we're on the receiving end of unfair critique and judgment from coworkers and bosses, when we're on the receiving end of mean comments and people looking down on us, strangers, do we imitate Christ and show his love and compassion towards them? Or are we inclined to defend and justify ourselves because we have been wronged? Jesus has compassion, and he has compassion for you as well. May those of us who identify as Christ's followers walk in his compassion, embody it to those he's placed into our lives. In the last and final portion of our text this morning, which is verses 54 to the end, we're going to see Jesus face deep rejection. In fact, he's going to be rejected by two groups of people. The first group is really one person, and it's Peter. Peter, whose name means rock, which Jesus gave when he chose him and called him to be one of the 12 back in chapter 6 of Luke. This is the same Peter who, when Jesus asks in Luke 9, "Who do you say I am?" this Peter confesses, "You are the Christ of God." And earlier in this chapter, just the scene before in the Last Supper, it's the same Peter who proclaims, "Lord, I'm willing to go with you both to prison and to death." It's this Peter, this rock, who succumbs under the pressure and ends up crumbling into pieces of rubble, rejecting his king 3 times in one night. I want you to take a close look at the 3 times Peter rejects Jesus. Next slide. In the first rejection, verses 56 to 57, Peter denies any ties that he has with Jesus. "Woman, I don't know him." In the second rejection, Peter denies any association with the rest of the disciples. "I'm not one of them." And in the last rejection, they call out Peter for his Galilean accent, which, you really can't deny your accent. But Peter says, "I don't even know what you're talking about." The type of language that's encapsulated here that Peter uses with each of his rejections, the same language that the Jews would use against those who are dismissed in a court of law, those who are banned or cut off from the rest of society. "We no longer know you. We have nothing to do with you." Essentially, Peter, afraid for his life, cuts himself off from the very person and community that matters most to him. Now, the second group that rejects Jesus is the council of elders, which were made up of the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They confront Jesus, "If you are the Christ, tell us." And Jesus responds, "If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer." This has been their pattern throughout all of Luke's gospel. The list that I have next is not exhaustive, but here are some examples. Chapter 6, when Jesus heals on the Sabbath, the Pharisees are filled with fury and discuss with one another what they might do with Jesus. Chapter 11, when Jesus pronounces woes against the Pharisees, they lie in wait, wanting to catch something that he would say that would mess him up. Chapter 14, another Sabbath healing. The Pharisees could not reply. Chapter 17, when Jesus teaches about money, the Pharisees ridicule Jesus. Chapter 20, when they question Jesus on where his authority comes from, the Pharisees have no idea where it comes from. Second instance, in verse 26, we talk about paying taxes to Caesar. The Pharisees just marvel at Jesus' answers, and they're silent. Verse 40, when they talk about the resurrection, Luke records that the Pharisees no longer dare to ask Jesus a question. And next slide. Earlier in this chapter, it says the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to put him to death, for they feared the people. The Jewish leadership already had made up their minds on who Jesus was. There was no softening of their hardness of hearts. They simply would not accept him as their Messiah King. And so we continue on in verse 69. Jesus declares, "But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." And so they all said, Are you the Son of God then?" And he said to them, "You say that I am." Then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips." What I want you to take away in this last section here is this. In spite of people's rejection of who he was, it doesn't change the truth about who Jesus is. Let me say it again. Despite the denials from those closest to him and those in power about who he was, they don't take away from the fact and the truth of who Jesus is. In fact, Jesus is in full control. Jesus is the one with total and complete authority. Their rejections do not mean that Jesus is less authoritative. That's on them and not on Jesus. Look how he proclaims his kingship. "From now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God." This particular proclamation was highly offensive to the Jewish leadership. Jesus was asserting that he himself is the Son of Man that was prophesied about in Daniel 7. Next slide. "And behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. It was blasphemy to their ears that Jesus would claim the right just to walk in to the presence of God. No mere man can sit with God. God is unique and holy. But catch this, if Jesus didn't blaspheme, quote unquote blaspheme from their perspective, or in other words, if Jesus didn't witness against himself, the Jewish leadership would have no grounds to present Jesus to the Roman courts. They didn't have the power to execute anyone. Only the Romans could. And like I mentioned earlier, all throughout Luke's gospel, they were left speechless or left without any sort of evidence whatsoever to bring against Jesus. And it wasn't until now, in this particular night, because Jesus, being faithful to who he was, proclaiming his right as king, and Caesar is not, do they finally have something solid to charge Jesus with. Simply put, Jesus had to convict himself with the truthful claim in order for things to quote unquote work out for them. Jesus can't lie about who he is. He can't deny himself. He is God. Can you see the irony that's existing all throughout this entire section? None of this would have happened if Jesus didn't say what he said and proclaim truth about himself. They think they've got Jesus. They think they're the ones who is bringing condemnation. But instead, Jesus is the true ultimate judge. And in fact, the whole night's worth of proceedings were all expedited illegally, according to the Mishnah, which was the embodiment of the oral tradition of authority governed by Jewish law. There's seven sort of violations. First, the proceedings did not take place at the temple. Second, Jesus is allowed no defense. Third, Jesus actually doesn't blaspheme by using the divine name. Fourth, the verdict comes on the same day of the trial, when 2 days are actually required for capital crimes. Fifth, Jesus is being tried on a feast day, the Passover, and it's normally prohibited to be tried on a feast day. Sixth, contradictory testimony is supposed to exonerate the defendant. The Jewish leadership could not get any two quote-unquote witnesses to agree on the same charge against Jesus. And last one, the high priest is not supposed to issue the pronouncement of guilt. 7 violations against what is governed by the Mishnah. But Jesus allowed all this to happen, and in his timing. Jesus allowed the soldiers to beat him and to mock him and to blaspheme against him. Jesus foretold about Judas' betrayal. Behold, the hand of him who betrays me is with me at the table. And he allows Judas to betray him. Have you ever thought, how did Judas know Jesus was going to be at the Mount of Olives? If you look at the beginning verse of our text this morning, it says that it was Jesus' custom to go to the Mount of Olives. Jesus knew he was going to be betrayed, but he didn't change course and go elsewhere to evade capture. Jesus didn't call on legions of angels to deliver him from the crowd that arrested him with swords and clubs. Jesus gives himself up to the Jewish leadership and ordains that this hour is theirs and the power of darkness to rule and to reign. See, there's nothing that happens, there's nothing that exists outside of the full knowledge and authority of who Jesus is. And let's go back to Peter real quick. What do you think was the look on Jesus' face when he locked eyes with Peter, when the rooster crowed as Peter was speaking his third denial? Do you think Jesus was surprised and disappointed? Peter, how? How could you do this? How could you let me down? Or do you think Jesus was angry? Peter, you said you would be allegiant with me in imprisonment and in death. You said that I was the Christ. I put in so much work, so much time, so much investment into discipling you, and this is what I get? This is how you follow me? Or do you think Jesus had compassion for Peter? Your answer to this question reveals your view of who Jesus is. Who do you think he is? Personally, in my flesh, I would have been disappointed and angry and hurt by Peter's betrayal, because when things don't go my way, when I don't see the results that I expect to see, I get frustrated. But there's nothing that surprises God. Everything is according to His will. His plans and His purposes are sure. Peter weeps bitterly at his own betrayal, but Jesus had already begun to show compassion prior to his betrayal. Peter just didn't know and he didn't comprehend. Remember, what does Jesus say before He predicts Peter's 3 denials? Satan wants to sift y'all like wheat. He wants y'all to be unfaithful. But I prayed for you, Peter, that your faith may not fail. And when you have returned again, strengthen your brothers. And we know from John's Gospel at the end of it that Jesus restores Peter over a catch of fish and breakfast on the shore. And we know from Acts and other books in the New Testament how Peter boldly proclaims Christ to the nations. See, Jesus may have been deeply rejected, but He was in full control. Nothing exists and operates outside of His power and authority. And if you think about the truth of this, of who Jesus is, how freeing it is for those of us who are in Christ, to know that in spite of our rebellion, in spite of all the times that we say, I'm sorry, I messed up, in spite of our uncertainty of the future, in spite of all the fears and the worries and the suffering that belabor us, in spite of all the idols and the addictions that ensnare us, in spite of the powers of darkness that deceive us, Jesus, the Christ, our Messiah King, is reigning with complete authority. And He has compassion for you. He has compassion for you. He knows you. He loves you deeply beyond what you can imagine or even think that you deserve. He intercedes for you on your behalf with every breath that you inhale and exhale. Live in that freedom. Listen to what Jesus says in John chapter 10, verse 27 to 30. There's a slide for this. My sheep hear my voice and I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life and they will never perish, and no one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of the Father's hand. I and the Father are one. Now, if you're here today, this morning, and you don't know Jesus or profess and follow Him as your King, then I want to invite you to discover who He is, to join us in that, because that's what we've been doing throughout our journey in Luke. That's what Luke has been presenting for Theophilus at the beginning of Luke, so that he can make an educated decision on whose side he's on. And so as we're going through Luke, as we're nearing the end of it, what's our educated decision? We have no king but Jesus. There is no other king but Jesus. Just because you consider yourself a devout follower of Jesus or believe that you have a deep intimacy in your relationship with Jesus does not protect you. It doesn't save you from the power of temptation to fall into sin and unfaithfulness or from the attacks of the evil one. Look at Judas and Peter, both of whom followed Jesus closely for 3 years. They walked closely in His footsteps. And look what they ended up doing. And the Jewish leadership who was in the temple courts day by day with Jesus, their hardness of hearts. Another phrase that Maddie has been learning recently is, I copy dada, I copy mama. So if we're drinking coffee, I copy dada, drink coffee. If she starts eating ramen, I copy mama eating ramen. Or I copy this, I copy that. A lot of the associations we have, a lot of the relationships and the feelings that we have towards certain people, certain things, certain objects, we learn those from others initially, and then we adapt and make our own associations. The bottom line is we were created to follow. Yes, we were created to rule and to reign, but to do that on God's behalf. Yes, we were created in God's image, but we were created in God's image to image God to others. Who or what do you follow? And does it align with who Jesus has revealed Himself to be? Look at the example of our King Jesus. Discover who he is. In the face of great anguish, Jesus was obedient to the Father. Even as a victim of grave injustice, Jesus had compassion for his enemies and loved ones. And in spite of suffering deep rejection, Jesus reigns with complete authority. Is your version, is your understanding of Jesus aligned with who he actually has revealed himself to be in the Scriptures? And how will you respond in faithfulness? I pray you won't be like Judas, who was overwhelmed with regret, or like the Jewish leadership who were stricken with the hardness of heart. But I pray that you would be like Peter, live freely and boldly and restored unto Jesus. Would you pray with me? I'm just going to pray through a Psalm of David, Psalm 139, to close us. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in, behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain it. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If I would count them, they are more than the sand. I awake and I am still with you. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. O men of blood, depart from me. They speak against you with malicious intent. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with complete hatred. I count them my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. May God bless the reading of his word. I'll give you the next couple of seconds to respond and to reflect.